I did not understand wrestling. I had no idea about it. I had no experience of it. So I was completely novice in that world, and I had to be educated, and it was surprisingly complicated to get my head around. It's a bit like sort of trying to catch up on 30 or 40 years of EastEnders, in an afternoon.
Welcome to Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies. Each episode we'll be speaking to an incredible screenwriter who's kindly dug out their initial screenplay for what became a beloved movie, discussing what changed, what didn't, and why, from first draft to the big screen. This week we're joined by the fantastic Stephen Merchant. In 2001, Stephen wrote his name into British TV history with The Office, his and Ricky Gervais' acclaimed workplace mockumentary, regarded today as one of the most influential sitcoms of all time. Since then, Stephen has juggled work on both sides of the camera, writing, directing, and starring in a string of acclaimed comedies, from Extras to his very own HBO show, Hello Ladies. Last year, Stephen enjoyed one of his biggest successes yet. Fighting With My Family, his big screen adventure telling the real-life story of a girl from Norwich with dreams of becoming a professional wrestler, was co-produced by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Its unusual mix of in-the-ring action, heartfelt drama, and outrageous comedy saw it championed by critics and audiences alike. Here's what Stephen had to say about the story threads he abandoned, the terrible name the film almost had, and the joy of burying exposition in extremely inappropriate jokes. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Kemal Demek. Over to Stephen. Stephen Merchant, thanks for joining us. Over the last few months of lockdown, as people have been seeking out movies to distract them from the horrors of the real world, Fighting With My Family has turned up on quite a few lists of feel-good films. I wanted to start by asking what your relationship is with that phrase, feel-good film, and if that is what you set out to make.
Well, firstly, I'm very pleased that it's made it onto a lot of feel-good lists, and that it's only taken a international, global, health crisis to really make the film connect with people. But I did want it to be feel-good, and my ambition was, in all seriousness, to reduce grown men to tears. I've always liked that idea as an ambition. I picture a kind of very hard bloke, sort of guy who doesn't mind getting into a ruck in a pub on a Saturday night, who's kind of brought to tears by this film. That, in all seriousness, was a sort of kind of guiding light for me, and partly because that's something I like in films myself. I'm quite sentimental, I think, in some ways, and I like films that kind of move me emotionally. I remember years ago I did film reviewing when I was still in my early 20s, and I was sent to see The Bridges of Madison County with Meryl Streep and Clint Eastwood, which, for a young man in his early 20s, about sort of two middle-aged people having a kind of, summer romance, wasn't the obvious fit. I remember being in kind of very moist of eye at the end of the film, and all the other kind of hardened critics letting them leave the cinema before I left, because I was embarrassed, and I'm just gonna watch all the credits, guys. I'll meet you in the bar. I just need to check who the best boy is. And so that the idea that a film could affect you in that way, I've always found very appealing. And this story, this true life story, seemed to have elements of that. That was certainly one of my ambitions.
It's probably worth noting at this point that your film is the only film on these feel-good movie lists to include lines like bowling ball in the bollocks. Paddington had very few bowling balls in the bollocks, as far as I can recall.
Well, that's the other thing. It's sort of trying to make a film that... it's quite funny how a number of times I've seen comments, either people have tweeted me or I've heard it from friends where they say... they said, I was not expecting to be in tears by the end of this, in a kind of dismissive way, like clearly that wasn't my intention, that sort of that somehow that just happened by accident, and it's like, and it's funny as well that sometimes that's used against you, as though sort of to affect someone emotionally is an easy thing to do or is not premeditated. It's very hard, obviously, as you know, to take people on an emotional journey to the point that they've invested enough that they could get kind of emotional by the end. And that's, and it's hard to do, I think, in a world in which we kind of are much more cine literate, and we sort of know the tricks, and we are suspicious when we feel our buttons being pressed. So those are the sort of obstacles you're trying to overcome.
Yeah, and that's interesting, the idea of expectation, because I remember I used to work in, I'm dating myself here, I used to work in a Blockbuster Video, and we used to get in films from WWE studios that were The Marine and The Commando and See No Evil, which I think had the tagline, "This summer, evil gets raw." So these, the expectation from films by this studio are not, you're not expecting to be made to cry. You're not expecting the tenderness that this film did have. Was it, how did you go about kind of broaching the idea of telling a different type of story?
Well, I think there's this misapprehension that this, is that the word I'm looking for? Or misconception that this film originated with WWE, or that I was somehow approached by them, or that this was like a kind of promotional piece for the WWE. That was not how the film came about. It came about because it was a documentary made by Channel 4 without any involvement with the WWE, a documentary that was seen subsequently by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He was filming Fast and Furious, whatever, in London, couldn't sleep, was watching late night Channel 4, as you do. He never misses grand designs. And this came on afterwards, and he was watching it, and he, as a former wrestler, related to the story, and through various kind of sort of mutual friends, and also, having worked with him before, it made its way to me. And that was where it originated. The WWE only became involved later because we needed permission from them to use elements of the story, which they're quite proprietary, and they own certain parts of the main character Paige's sort of life story, if you like.
Yeah.
And so we had to involve them in order to get access. Otherwise, we'd have had to have created a sort of fictional wrestling outfit. You know how sometimes you see there's like, they can't use the NFL, so it's like it's the American Football League. And so we were quite keen to kind of keep those elements of authenticity. And so they ended up becoming involved and putting some money into it because they liked the idea. But I never had any remit from them. I never had any interference from them in terms of what I could say or what I couldn't say. So what grabbed me was that it was a story about a family and a British family and this working class girl, and this success story that I sort of hadn't heard of. And I was a little ashamed in a way that I'd never heard of this kind of working class Norwich girl who'd gone from sort of nothing to the big leagues of wrestling. And I just thought that, I don't know, it just seemed to have a lot of elements that were unlikely. And that kind of gave it some sort of, uniqueness. I forget entirely what your question was, but I think that is some way to answering it.
You mentioned Paige's story there, and it kind of struck me that it's almost like a classic hero's journey arc. So like Luke Skywalker, she's from this kind of nowhere place that's not supposed to breed heroes, but she gets picked for this incredible destiny like Luke, undergoes training like Luke. And I mean, The Rock and Yoda as mentor characters are a little bit different in size, but you get my point. And then she kind of hits this brick wall in reaching her destiny. She learns to kind of embrace herself instead of being this person she thinks she's supposed to be. And then she kind of achieves her dream. Was that all in Paige's real life story, or did you have to embellish much or change much to kind of make her real life rise to wrestling fame satisfying for movie audiences?
Well, in the documentary that originally aired, the movie is about this, this close-knit wrestling family. Brother and sister are both dreaming of big leagues in the WWE, which for people who don't understand wrestling is as big as it gets. It's Hollywood, it's Broadway for wrestlers. And they both competed to try and get into WWE, only she made it. And the documentary ends with her kind of going off to America and having sort of early kind of experiences in America. And that's where it ends. And that was satisfying as a documentary, but it didn't quite have enough of an arc, it seemed to me, for a film. And so I met with the family and I spoke with Paige herself, and I did not understand wrestling. I had no idea about it. I had no experience of it. So I was completely novice in that world, and I had to be educated, and it was surprisingly complicated to get my head around. It's a bit like sort of trying to catch up on 30 or 40 years of EastEnders, in an afternoon. There's a lot of machinations. There's a lot of stories within stories. And that was what was confusing. But she told me, and the night that I won the the Divas title, I was in tears, and I said, well, what's the Divas title? And explain that to me. And she said, oh, well, it's the sort of title you win. And I was like, what's that, like the heavyweight championship of the world? And she said, yes. And she told me that it was such an emotional journey getting to that point, that even though when she won, as it were, the wrestling heavyweight title of the world, it was fake or phony or whatever you want to call it, or predetermined, even though that was sort of in itself artificial, the emotion of winning was as real as if she had actually won the heavyweight title, because she'd been through so much to get there. And that was what seemed the kind of payoff for the movie to me. It was like, oh, yes, this is a Rocky story. And even though it's a sort of artificial sport, the emotions that the family and she experienced getting there are as real as in a real sport, if that makes sense. And that was the moment in which I realized there was a sort of satisfying conclusion, at least for the film, that it did have that hero's journey, as you said, because she had overcome a lot of obstacles. She had almost quit. She'd almost given up. You know, she was away from home. She was young. She was bullied, or she felt she was bullied, and all these other things. And so it felt, and then she kind of finally had her victory, and on her first appearance on the main roster, as they say, she won the title. So it felt like there was a sort of a ready-built Rocky story in there that's quite rare to find. I think normally you do have to massage the truth to find that. And I think there are obviously other versions of the story you could tell, because since we made the movie, you know, her life has taken other routes, and there's a number of versions of this story you could tell, but there is also this kind of Rocky version, which is the one that I went for.
And yeah, it's actually really clear, even in this first draft, that you've gone quite quickly from a point of not knowing anything about wrestling, as you say, to being completely immersed in it. I mean, all the terminology is in there, and when you're directing when you're like describing the action scenes, it's not just like they wrestle. You have all the names of the moves and all this kind of thing. You obviously kind of really steep yourself in the sport and the culture around it. Like, how did you go about that? What was the process of learning about wrestling?
Well, I spent a lot of time with the real life family, and I spent long hours on the phone with Paige herself, and I taped all those calls with her permission. And I kind of, and I would refer back to them, and I would, and then I went to WrestleMania with Dwayne, and I watched WrestleMania, and I sat in the audience, and then I also met with the wrestlers backstage, and I met with Dwayne, and I sat with Dwayne, and he told me a lot about how it works, and I just sort of did my research really, and occasionally I would have to call someone and go, I'm so confused by, there's this thing called the receipt. What does that mean? And it's this idea that you punish someone for kind of stepping out of line by giving them a real slap as opposed to a fake slap, and all these sort of these things, and initially it was quite hard because I think the wrestling community is quite protective of its secrets. It's a bit like the magic circle. They're sort of mistrustful of you. But once I'd sort of persuaded them I was taking this seriously, they sort of trusted me. And so I had a kind of writer's assistant who was also more of a fan of wrestling and knew more about it already. So he also knew a lot of the terms, and he could help me with that. So yeah, it was just a process of research really. And what was incredibly difficult, and I did various kind of aborted first drafts, which didn't lead anywhere, because there was so much information that it seemed you needed to convey to the non-wrestling audience in order for it to make sense. And I kept thinking, like, would my mum understand this? Because I had struggled so much to understand it that so for instance, there's this whole confusion of kind of what is real and what isn't real, right? And so when you're writing a boxing movie, everyone understands that the rules of boxing essentially, and they understand that if Rocky knocks out Apollo Creed and he falls to the mat and the 10 count happens, he's won, and they understand that rule, and that's all that Rocky needs to do in a sense to win. Whereas in wrestling, the success you have as a wrestler is as much about being a performer and entertaining the crowd as it is winning the title. And so you have this whole showbiz side of it, along with the kind of winning and losing. And so I realized I had to explain that to the audience. They call it going over with the crowd.
Yeah.
Have you been, as the crowd won you over? And so you've got to sort of explain that, for instance, and there's a number of elements like that you have to explain in order to make Page's victory a victory, because obviously the sport itself is not really real. So so it becomes really complicated, because you've got to sort of, I kept referring it as underwiring. Like, you have to do all this sort of underwiring in the script to just explain to an audience that doesn't follow wrestling what is important and what the rules are and what you need to understand. I mean, it just is incredibly complicated. And so I think on the surface, the film looks quite straightforward and it has the clean hero's journey, but sort of filtered into all of that is all of this info that you need in order to sort of enjoy the payoff at the end.
Yeah, and you bury that exposition and that explanation in these hilarious scenes. There is one wonderful scene that I never really realized what the story function of it was until I kind of sat down with this first draft. But there's this wonderful scene where like the family, Rhea and Zach's parents, have the parents of Courtney, Zach's girlfriend, over to dinner. And it's a hilarious scene, but also it's a chance for you to bring into the script these characters who are outsiders to the sport, who actively say, but it's fake, right? And that's beneath all the jokes. You almost don't realize you're also being fed the explanation of, yes, it's fake, but the stakes are real. Is that kind of tricky to write and to do to deliver that information, but do it in an entertaining way?
Well, that scene, the dinner scene, originated from a real story that the real family told me about when they met Zach's parents for real. So they did, a version of that did happen, and there was a sort of weird meeting of minds. And so I always thought that was going to be a funny scene anyway, just because it's the family themselves are so extreme that it seemed a good way of kind of I don't know, both it was funny, but also it was, like you say, it was a way of bringing the non-wrestling viewer into this environment and kind of asking the questions that I had been asking in my research. So that was always the intention of it. But I suspect in that first draft you read, there was probably a lot more exposition than we actually put in the finished film, because I think I probably had them trying to cover all kinds of bases, to answer all kinds of questions. And in the end, the chief function in the movie, like you say, was both to explain that it's kind of that it's the levels of fakery, but also how much the family love the sport, and also the family dream is to wind up in the WWE and what that represents. And so by them kind of selling that idea to the in-laws, I think hopefully you explain to the audience the what this dream is and why it's so important to the family. Because that was another big concern of mine, was throughout the movie, Paige is constantly questioning whether she wants this, whether she wants to be a wrestler, whether she wants to be in America. And it was sort of important somehow that you understood that this dream was real, and that it wasn't just silly and frivolous, and that this was sort of a life goal for the family and for her. And to try and explain that passion, that was another way of sort of expressing that, by using that family scene to kind of to have them evangelize about wrestling.
This is more of a kind of directorial touch of yours than a screenwriting one, but I love the small detail in that scene where Courtney's mum is lifting a spring roll to her mouth just as Julia says, "You should see his cock."
That's right, yes. Well, we did variations of that. We did kind of lots of outtakes with Julia Davis, who's playing that kind of slurping on a noodle, or various attempts at that. I mean, that scene in its unedited version goes on for ages, and it's, it was like a 10-minute scene in the cutting room, because we'd all been improvising, and and obviously, as always with films, you have to kind of pare it back to the essentials.
Yeah.
But that was a good example, like you say, of trying to bury exposition, and it's, like I say, it's very hard. It was very hard in this film. There's exposition constantly that you have to lay out. So The Rock has to show up and explain this idea of going over with the audience, and Vince Vaughn has to explain what's needed of you, the stamina, the athleticism, and the family needs to explain to you that it's not all fake, and so you're just constantly dishing out this information in order to make the kind of second half of the film make sense, I guess, again, to the non-wrestling audience.
Yeah, to Mrs. Merchant.
To Mrs. Merchant.
Shout out Mrs. Merchant. So to dive into kind of like the first draft in a bit of detail, the first few pages are pretty much the same, but I kind of wanted to talk about them because they accomplish so much so quickly. So we start off with young Zach and Rhea watching wrestling. He loves it. She's bored by it and wants to change the channel. They start fighting. The dad, Ricky, comes in. We fully expect him to do the sensible parental thing and kind of break them up. He says, Zach, what the fuck are you doing? Zach looks up. Ricky continues, if you're going to choke her, your arm should be here. And instantly we get the dynamic. It's this mad wrestling family in which Rhea is kind of the reluctant one. Can you tell me a little bit about writing this intro scene and what it needed to achieve?
Well, again, one of the difficulties was that the family and Paige had shared so many funny stories of their life as wrestlers that I had so many. I mean, just when he first met his wife and how the family sort of tried to screw with him and they put deep heat in his underwear and he was going on a date with her after a wrestling match and he put on his underwear and had deep heat and his groin started to burn when he was on the date. I mean, there was scenes of them having fights with, frozen baguettes in supermarkets and I mean, just so much stuff. And I remember Paige told me a story of she was outside the house once and she got hit by a car and she was on the floor. And her dad came running out and went, all right, can you bend your legs? And she went, yeah. And he went, any double vision? And she said, no. And he goes, great, because you got a match in half an hour. And so there was this feeling of just this kind of traveling circus family where kind of, just pratfalls and injuries were just sort of part of growing up. And so it was trying to capture a bit of that flavor right off the bat and tell you that this is a sort of loving family, but an unorthodox one. But also that, which was true, that she had been reluctant to be a wrestler and had sort of been persuaded by her brother and her family to get in the ring for the first time because someone had bailed and they needed somebody. And she had wrestled with her brother who wore a pink Power Rangers outfit to reassure her because he obviously was supposed to be a female wrestling match, so he had to disguise himself. And she got in the ring on that first occasion and she learned some moves and she was just the cheer of the crowd and the thrill of it just won her over to wrestling and evangelized her to it. And I guess that was what I was trying to kind of capture in those first few scenes, like explain the family, explain it's a family business, but also see her love of this sport, let sort of, I guess, experience it with her. Because again, assuming you don't like wrestling as a viewer, and that was always my assumption that, the wrestling fans would already be on board, but what if you're not a wrestling fan like me? How could you explain what this means to this girl and why she's passionate and why she's willing to go through all these hurdles? And it's because you sort of see her come alive and experience being in the ring for the first time. And so that was a sort of attempt to lead the audience by the hand a little bit and to say, look, maybe you're not a fan of wrestling, but neither was she, and sort of, and take you in that way. And actually it's funny, I as we started shooting, I got nervous about that. I was suddenly worried. I was thinking, well, if she didn't like wrestling, will people think that I guess I was concerned that when she gets to her final big match, do you think that she's doing it for herself or do you assume she's only doing it for her family?
Right.
And I was worried that if somehow you didn't believe she wanted this, that it wasn't going to be a victory. She was sort of doing it begrudgingly somehow. And I was suddenly panicked that opening scene confused that maybe it was better if you just started and she was already a fan of wrestling. So you knew this was her dream from the beginning. Because it's not like you see Rocky kind of umming and ahhing about boxing and then he becomes a boxer, right? He's a boxer from the off.
Yeah, Rocky didn't start the film wanting to watch Charmed instead.
That's right, exactly. And so I suddenly panicked that was the wrong way to start the film and we were already shooting it and I was kind of trying to rewrite it. And I remember it was Vince Vaughn who said, no, this is a great opening and it takes people in and you should stick with it and don't second guess yourself. And I think he was right.
Yeah. And that's interesting. So when you kind of had those dilemmas, did you kind of decide in the end to kind of go with authenticity and to verge on that side? Because another thing that's not present in this first draft but does appear in the film is the brother. So not Zach, but another brother who's in prison for attacking someone with a slab of tarmac, I think it is. So he's not in this first draft. And I wondered sort of whether you kind of what you kind of wrestled with, no pun intended. Well, yeah, so what it was that kind of made you decide, actually, this is a real life thing. He needs to have a presence in the film.
Well, there was a couple of things with the brother. I think initially it was there's always that anxiety of too many characters, and it being confusing for an audience to track. And often the kind of criticism of biopics, as they say, is that they've condensed characters or they've combined characters. And although I began this probably trying to be determined not to do that, of course, very quickly you realize why it has to be done. It's just there are so many people to introduce and so much to explain that you can't include everybody. And so initially I thought, well, let's just keep the other brother out of it because he's not part of the primary story, and why introduce him if he's not needed for the story. And then I think somewhere along the line it occurred to me, less to do with authenticity and to do more with, the brother represents the path that Zach could take if he went off the rails, and he got depressed and he started drinking and he hit someone, maybe he'd wind up in jail as well, kind of like his older brother, which is sort of what happens. And so I thought, oh well, he could be a kind of like a ghost of Christmas future. This is what could happen if Zach, went off the rails. And so he seemed useful. So I put him back in, but then in subsequent drafts I put him in too much. And then you had like flashbacks with him, and you had scenes of him in jail, and he suddenly became this huge character. Yeah. And I was like, well, that's too much. So then I sort of paired him back to what he ends up with in the film. So again, he's in there partly because I wanted to suggest that there is a sort of darkness to this family and that they're not all sweetness and light. But also, like I say, that he served that role. And then also finally, I needed some kind of independent voice to say something to Zach at the end of the movie that would let him put himself in perspective, if that makes sense. I needed some, like in a romantic comedy, normally like the heroine has rejected the guy and then she sees her old grandmother and her grandmother says something innocent, but it gets the heroine's mind thinking, right? Yeah. That is the guy I should be with. And I kind of needed that. I needed the grandmother who sort of doesn't have any investment in the story and just sort of benignly says something and it triggers something in Zach's mind. And the brother was able to serve that function as well. So he did end up becoming like an important tool in the story.
And speaking of a different type of heroine, there is that amazing line in that first scene. Rhea says, "I don't want to be a wrestler." Her mum replies, "You'll love it, the buzz. It's more addictive than coke, crack and heroin combined." Rhea replies, "Have you done coke, crack and heroin?" Julia, "Not combined." Yeah.
Again, I wanted to sort of lay out the stall straight away. Like, this is what this family is. They're not conventional. They are edgy. They have got darkness in the path. And it's interesting you read that section out because you'll notice there's an F-bomb quite early in the script. And I think probably in the version you read, there's a lot more bad language. And originally it was a lot earthier in that way. And the intention, I think, was always to be, kind of slightly more adult. And it was only really late in the day that I think we realized that this was a story that was going to appeal to quite a lot of sort of teenagers, particularly teenage women, but also teenage boys. And I think we suddenly thought, well, it seems a bit of a shame to cut them out of the opportunity to see it, particularly in America where they're a lot more sort of rigorous about bad language. So we did sort of censor it slightly late in the day.
So as the film continues, we meet older Rhea. She's already got her name. So her dad introduces her as Paige. But in the finished film, you restructure it a little bit and you let her find that name for herself, like a fair bit later on in the film. Why was that important?
There was, again, I don't know if it was in that draft, but there was a long dialogue I had for a while in which the whole family keep talking about how they've all got fake names. So it's like, it's the father saying, I'm Ricky Knight, although Knight's not my real name. And then he says the real last name, and then Ricky's not his real name, that's his nickname. And then Sweet Soraya, the mother, says, my name's Julia, but I go by Sweet Soraya. But Soraya is actually my daughter's name, but she goes by Paige. And because they have all these fake stage names. And so there was a sort of convoluted kind of who's on first style conversation about that. Yeah. And again, I always loved it, but it was just too much information. Again, it was just like, this is already complicated. There's so much to explain. Do I need to explain, how their names are not their real names? And so it was all about just, again, thinning out, I guess, some of the weeds and letting because Paige in real life had chosen her stage name and she had based it on a character from Charmed, I just thought, well, why not see that moment rather than it already be done for her? And sort of, and I guess it's all part of just sort of her taking ownership of her life in small ways,
Yeah. And another element that isn't in the first draft is this scene quite early on when Zach and Rhea go for a run. They end up on this park bench and they have this real kind of brother-sister moment where we see in private the kind of dynamic between them. There's also that great line, "You're a knight, wrestling's in your blood," to which Rhea replies, "That makes it sound like hepatitis." Did you add that scene into later drafts because you wanted more focus on their relationship? It really does end up feeling like the heartbeat of the film.
I have a feeling that either in the draft you read or again in subsequent drafts, I think the mother has that conversation with Rhea. There's a conversation about Rhea has to have this wobble. She's not sure that she's going to be able to pull it off in the big tryout scene. And I'm sure there were versions where she had a conversation with her mother, she had a conversation with her father. And then again, at some point, like you say, it was like, well, hang on, the core of this story is that the brother is the one who supports her. He's the one who sort of taught her these moves. He's the one who got in the ring with her that first time. He's the one who's going to sort of help her at the end of the movie. And so, yes, of course, it should be him here who gives her this kind of pep talk. So like you say, it's just kind of that trying to double down on the importance of their relationship, the kind of the closeness they have and the bond they have, because that bond is going to get broken in a few scenes' time. And so, yes, it was, to me, that the whole reason this story appealed to me when I saw that documentary. I sat down, I was not interested in wrestling. I was not expecting to enjoy it. I thought it was going to be a sort of rompy thing about people in tights, which to some degree it was. But as soon as the brother got rejected and the sister didn't, I just thought, oh my God, this is devastating. I just thought that was such an amazing, I was not expecting that in the documentary. I was kind of heartbroken for him. And I just thought, and it seemed to me that the brother, in a sense, was the beating heart of it. And his relationship with his sister and having to watch someone else live your dream and her sort of resent that and question that. I just thought that was devastating. And so, yes, so that became very much the kind of the soul of the film was their relationship. And like you say, therefore, the more I can do to kind of bond them together in the first act, the more I think heartbreaking it is when they sort of fall apart in the second act.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talk about this as like a Rocky story, but Rocky didn't have this like parallel storyline. So as one sibling is living out their dream, the other is kind of has had their dream taken away from them, and now they're staring at this prospect of like a future in the town where they grew up, and they don't have the sport they love anymore, or they're not able to do it professionally. And he kind of goes on, he sort of falls into a really difficult path. I mean, that is, as you say, it's pretty devastating. And I'm interested to hear a little bit about sort of like how you brought out the emotion in those scenes and in Zach's arc.
Well, I think, again, in a various iterations of the sort of unfinished first drafts, I think I went a lot darker with Zach. Because in real life, the brother, and he was very honest with me, he did, he had a real depressive period, and he really struggled with that rejection, and he got to some dark places. And a lot of that was in the original scripts, and a lot more about his relationship with his wife and his kid. And again, I think in part because of sort of page count, and in part because it started to get very bleak in a way. Yeah. And it sort of somehow, I don't know whether it unbalanced the story or something, but at some point I had to pull back on that. And so I think we still hint at it. And funnily enough, even when we did test screenings, that people kept saying they were really sad for Zach. And it's funny how in a test screening, audience will say they're very depressed about something, and even though it all is all happy in the end, they can't let go of how they felt earlier in the movie, and so when they do the test feedback at the end, they go, I was really sad for Zach. And I'm in the back of the room silently thinking, you're supposed to be fucking sad for Zach, of course you are. And so we ended up cutting out, even in the editing room, more and more of the sadness, because we discovered that a little goes a long way, really. And so again, I think in the script, we laid into the the conflict between the brother and sister, and the his sort of sadness and his rejection, and so it was always a really tough balance, I think, between making sure that he was kind of resentful enough that you could build to this kind of clash that they have in the wrestling ring, but not so much that you lost all sympathy for him as a character. It was a very fine line, and I think it's a testament to Jack who plays him, that I think you sort of, on the whole, retain sympathy for him, even in the film, because he got to some dark places.
It really does inject some realness into the film, because 99.9% of people watching, they live Zach's character arc, not Paige's, right?
Well, it's funny. Again, it's a shame in a sense that the trailer for the film reveals that information, that he got rejected. Because, again, in early test screenings, when they didn't know the story, audiences, you could hear them audibly gasp when he didn't get chosen. I mean, there was a real intake of breath and a kind of, oh my God. I mean, I think that was not where people thought the story was going. And that was kind of thrilling. But of course, in order to sell the film, they had to sort of explain a little bit of the plot. And so they put that in the trailer. So again, I think, like for me, when I watched the documentary, I had no idea that was coming. And so it was a real shock. And so I do think that's the sort of, that's the kind of emotional crux of the film there. And that's what gives it, I don't know, like you said, I hope that's what gives it a little bit of an edge. And, I wanted it to sort of stay humorous and have humor where it was appropriate, but I wanted it to have this emotional punch. I was never thinking of it as a comedy. I was always just thinking of it as telling this story, and using humor where I could, but not sort of chasing laughs, and letting that pathos land.
Is that pretty typical for you? Do you try and put genre and like the idea of comedy, which inherently has this expectation of like punchlines and gags interspersed at regular intervals, do you try and put that aside usually when you write, so you can tell a story organically, and then the humor, you just trust the humor to come out in it?
Well, I think I do. And I think also in particular in this, but yes, I've never, in all of the stuff I've done, I don't think we've ever chased gags at the expense of the reality or the investment in the world. I think that's always my fear, is that you'll disengage with the story because it feels too farcical, or it feels too silly or something. And there were scenes and jokes we definitely cut out in this because we felt that they tipped the balance. And so, yes, I never wrote it trying to think what's the comic angle on this scene. It was always sort of what is the truth of this scene, and then is there some humor to be had? And I think sometimes there are those kind of true life stories that you'll see where they've tried to sort of turn them into comedies, and then I sometimes think they don't really work as either, because they're not quite funny enough, because they have to obey the rules of the real story. Yeah. But they're not, you don't kind of really engage because it seems a bit too silly or a bit too farcical or something. So it's a tough balance, that. I kept thinking about movies like, I was thinking about films like The Fighter, which is about a sort of sibling relationship. When I was working on this, and other quite bleak films. And then sort of thinking, well, how could I sort of tell those stories but add some humor as we go?
That's interesting.
Sweeten the pill, if you like.
Yeah. Which is something that you've done since The Office, really.
Right. I mean, I would think a lot of people would think that The Office isn't funny. But certainly, again, we were very scrupulous about taking out jokes where we thought that it just seemed too convenient or too written, too sitcom-y. And it's always that's always a tricky balance, for what I think is subtle, someone else might think is broad. It's a constant, it's just a question of taste, really. And sometimes there are things which are just too, like the throwing a bowling ball in the bollocks. I mean, I saw them do things like that for real, which is why I put it in. It wasn't, I didn't make it up for the movie, but of course I'm sure a lot of people will think, oh, it's just a bowling ball in the bollocks. That's not subtle, but listen, that's the family. That's wrestling.
Yeah. And the way Zach's storyline kind of wraps up, he seems to find kind of like equilibrium and he finds meaning in a life without fame and success that he's been chasing right up until the point where he's told he's let go from the WWE. That again really reminded me of The Office. It seems like that's something you're interested in, sort of like people who have to kind of like find meaning in ordinary lives and in sort of lives of kind of like just everyday, small town, mundane kind of existence. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's like goes back to what I loved about the story, was that it was always Zach's story, really, to me. In a sense, if you told it only from Paige's perspective, she hardly tries. She's talented naturally. She's appealing. She has stagecraft, charisma. She gets chosen on her first attempt, basically. She goes to America. Yes, it's a bit difficult, and then she becomes a star. And it's like, well, that's, we've seen that story. But the brother left behind story, that somehow was what gave it something fresh. It's heartbreaking. And like you say, I'm always interested in those, those lives of the lives where they didn't quite plan out as you'd expected or you'd hoped. And like you say, yes, it was there in the office, and it's sort of been through everything that I've done. And I think it's an anxiety that I have about if my life hadn't played out quite the way it had, where would I be? But I think throughout it, what's always been important to me is that, as I sincerely say in the film, just because a million people aren't cheering your name, it doesn't mean your life doesn't have value. And I really believe that. And I think we do live in a world in which celebrity and fame and money are sort of seen as markers of success. And actually, it's funny, during this lockdown, people clapping for the NHS, it's taken this for people to stand outside and applaud, nurses and hospital porters and all these other people that are kind of unsung, really, in a way. And I think I think we've always been interested in that, and that was why it was important to me that I didn't want to portray Norwich as a slum, and I didn't want to portray England as this place you have to leave and you'll never be happy in England unless you go to America. I wanted it just to be about Zach realizing the importance of the things he has at home and why they're valuable. And I'd seen that just by hanging out with him, and I'd seen him training people.
Yeah. And
they worship him. He's like a little god when he walks in the room, and there's all these oddball kids from the sort of neighborhood, and these, as I called them, stray cats, I think, or something.
They're called the strays.
They're called the strays, because that's what they were like when I saw them hanging out with him. He was like he's like a sort of benign kind of a benign sort of taskmaster or whatever, or sergeant major. He just sort of call them to attention, and they do whatever he said. And he was giving them discipline, and he genuinely had trained a blind kid to wrestle, and he'd trained another kid who was off the rails to wrestle. And so I don't know, that seemed of enormous value to me, and I wanted to sort of celebrate that in the film.
Another thing that sort of evolved from this first draft is the other girls that Rhea is in competition with. Because in this first draft, they're kind of set up as pretty mean. And in the final, which is like a lot more in keeping with the tradition of like the sports movie. Whereas in the final film, you kind of really turn that trope on its head, and it's revealed that actually like they're all struggling in their own way, and they have this camaraderie by the end of it. So can you tell me a little bit about how you approached that and why you decided to change that up?
Well, that's a good example of why research is useful even once you've written the script, in the case of a true story, because obviously a lot of my initial experience with the story was through the documentary and was through the family and was through Paige. And Paige's take on her experience in the WWE was that early on she had felt fish out of water, she'd felt very alone, she'd felt bullied by these other women. And so that was the version that I put in those early drafts. And then I was filming Logan in Mississippi or somewhere, or New Orleans, and I had a few days off, and so I flew to Florida to the WWE training center because I wanted to go there, I wanted to see it, and I wanted to meet some of the trainers that had worked with Paige. And while I was there, I said, to one of the trainers, "Oh well, of course Paige felt very bullied," and the woman sort of went, "Okay, sure." And I went, "What do you mean? What's the pause?" And she went, "Well, sometimes they felt bullied by Paige." I said, "Well, tell me more." And they said, "Well, because she'd been wrestling since she was young, and she was by the time she arrived, she sort of felt she knew everything, and so she was a little bit kind of aggressive and a bit standoffish and whatever." And so that suddenly gave me a new perspective on this. That, oh yeah, that's what happens, right? If you go to a foreign country and you are nervous, and you sometimes lash out and you perhaps don't even realize you are. And so then I thought, well, let's play with that idea that Paige, we're sort of following it through Paige's eyes. And so we assume these girls are kind of mean girls, but actually let's reveal that they're not mean girls. They're just other women just trying to make their way in this world. And that, I don't know, it just seemed to give a different flavor to it, or perhaps felt more in keeping with the truth, as it was.
For Paige to win, she needs to sort of overcome this final hurdle. She has to have this phone call with Zach that I suppose when we talk about like the movie sort of reducing people to tears in unexpected ways, like this is one of the key moments. It's a really emotive conversation that's also funny. How hard was that to construct?
Well, there were a number of tricky elements in that she sort of ends up having three mentors, right? So I guess to use the Luke Skywalker version, he has Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first one, and then he has Yoda. And Yoda essentially takes the place of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yeah. And I know Obi-Wan Kenobi occasionally pops up, but essentially one replaces the other. But in this, I sort of had three. As I had the Vince Vaughn character, who was a conflation of a number of trainers that she had in real life. But I also had The Rock, because The Rock we wanted to put in as I guess an example. He was supposed to sort of almost be like, one of the gods stepping down from Olympus to sort of bestow, the kind of, I don't know, whatever it is, the golden ticket, the golden fleece or whatever on Paige. And then I also had to have her brother, because her brother was so important to her story. So I had all these sort of mentor figures, and each of them had to sort of give useful guidance in a way. It was like I had Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda and Darth Vader, and I had all these characters in one, and I had to give them all plenty to do. And so the first big challenge was, in reality, Dwayne Johnson had called Paige in and said, tomorrow night you're going to go on Monday Night Raw, you're going to make your debut on TV, and you're going to win the title. And he told her she's going to win the title. And so that's the version that I've filmed a version with where he tells her that. I don't know if in the version you have it has that, but there was certainly versions of the script where he says you're going to win the title. And so the audience will watch the movie and they will know she's going to win. And the challenge was, could you make people still care about this final fight? Yeah. Even if they knew the outcome. Because the outcome is not about whether she wins. It's about, does she win over the crowd? And does she not lose her nerve? And so I was trying to lift off the idea of whether she wins or loses. So we had that challenge. And then we also had this challenge of sort of, how can Zach give her that final piece of the jigsaw that she needs in order to triumph? And I had versions where he flew to America and he shows up in the dressing room and they speak in person. And in the end, I just went back to the reality of things, which is that he didn't come to America, and that they did speak on the phone and FaceTime and things. And that was sort of what we went back to. And we get to the test screening again, and we test it in front of an audience. And in the version they saw, Dwayne says, you're going to win the belt. And so they knew the outcome. And all the feedback was, we did not want to know the outcome.
Yeah.
We wanted to watch it and find out, And so we removed it. But it's interesting because people will say, well, why do we care? It's a fake sport. Who cares if they win or lose? You've tricked us. You made us care about this final match. It doesn't matter. It's not real. And I'm like, yeah, I know I tricked you. Yeah, I did.
Yeah. And as you say, the sort of success, or like, her breakthrough moment in terms of her character is not actually winning the fight, but it seems to be like the speech afterwards, where we've seen her earlier on in the script kind of really struggle and kind of choke when she has to kind of entertain the crowds. But here she embraces, we return to a line at the beginning of the film where someone calls her a freak, and she kind of like co-opts that in this speech and kind of embraces who she is. How much kind of searching did you need to do to kind of find that as like the really satisfying end of the arc?
Again, in various iterations of the script, I literally transcribed the actual fight that Paige did. And in the actual fight, she comes on and she kind of is nervous, and it's sort of kind of quite theatrical, and she's sort of play acting a bit. And then she I think she gives a few words on the mic, and then they have this very brief match, and it's sort of over. And for a long time I had it as it happened. And again, when I went to meet with Dwayne, and he was working on the script with me, he has a team of people that he's worked with at the WWE, and one of them said, "Oh, I remember when that happened." And because obviously a lot of the matches are sort of pre-scripted or pre-planned by the WWE writers, and they all agreed that they sort of hadn't done a great job. They wish they'd done a better job on writing the match, as it were.
So this was a big budget way of rewriting.
This was a big budget way, exactly, of doing it. And so, the speech that Paige gave is a sort of conflation of a number of speeches that she gave on the mic at various times in her actual career. So I've pulled bits in from other speeches she gave, where she talks about being a freak and proud of it and things like that, which is all sort of all things that she said at various points. And I sort of made a kind of greatest hits speech. And then I also let Florence, the actress, worked on it a little bit, and Dwayne worked on it a bit, and they kind of spitballed it a bit. And even on the day, they were sort of refining it a bit. And originally that she said the speech and then had the fight, and that's like, well, that doesn't make sense, because why are you really watching the fight because the speech is sort of what's important, and it's all about, does she win over the crowd? So it needs to end with the speech. And so there's endless refinement of that match, both on the day and in the weeks leading up to it, in the kind of rehearsal of it, and Dwayne helped block the match. And also the team at WWE had said that the match was also a bit underwhelming. They'd had way better matches, those women, in subsequent TV events. So we made the match itself better. It had bigger jumps and flips and things. So we just tried to that's certainly an area where I did depart from the reality to make it just more entertaining, basically. But I thought I sort of somehow gave myself license because wrestling itself does that, and so I sort of felt, well, I'm allowed to kind of massage the truth a bit.
Yeah. And then we end on that wonderful biopic convention of the titles at the end explaining what all these characters kind of went on to do, and then the final one, you have that punchline: Dwayne Johnson went on to have a successful career outside of wrestling.
Exactly. Yes.
Which is fun.
Well, I just wanted to, I as a fan of those sorts of movies, I always want to know what happened.
Yeah. I
always want to see real footage of the real people. Everyone loves that. I love that. And we argued back and forth throughout this movie about what of the conventions would we include. So for instance, for ages, I said, I'm not going to have a training montage.
Yeah.
Every sports movie has a training montage. I can't do that. That seems crazy. It seems cliched.
Yeah.
And then as we got further and further along, we're like, God, we need a training montage. I really miss a training. I really want a training montage. I've got a lot of information to convey.
Yeah.
It's just, you just want it. You just, as a viewer, you want it. And even if you think you don't, trust me, because I did a version without, you want it. You want it. You want to see that. You want the music. You want them training. You want to see that. It's why it's in all the sporting movies. It's just too satisfying and too enjoyable. And similarly, we can't put clips of the real family at the end. Everyone does that. But the real family are so kind of vivid, and because we had all that footage of them from the documentary, and also because I just didn't think people would believe they looked like the way we'd portrayed them and that they spoke like we'd portrayed them.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was a way of somehow clarifying the authenticity of the story by seeing what they look like and seeing the early footage of them as kids, and just, I don't know, somehow making you leave the cinema convinced that what we told you was true and not just made up. And in fact, funny enough, even though it says a true story at the top of the movie, a lot of people say, I didn't realize it was true until I saw the real family at the end. So actually it does serve a function.
Yeah. Or you at least assume a level of exaggeration, but then those scenes at the end actually reveal, oh, actually there isn't a crazy amount of exaggeration there at all.
Yeah. We'd recreated the way they dress and the way they speak. So it just seems like a valuable kind of coda.
Yeah. Did you enjoy writing it? It's like a fun film to watch. Was it arduous to write? You mentioned there were so many abortive attempts to get this first draft together.
I did enjoy it, but it was much, much harder than I'd expected. And it was hard for a number of reasons. One, because there was such a wealth of stories and information that they had told me. And I could have gone down a number of avenues, which I did initially. Like I say, about Zach meeting his wife, and about the strays and the people that they train and their backstories and their other lives, and flashbacks with the mum and dad and how they'd met and their romance, and various experiences Paige had in America. She got sick for a moment. She was in hospital. You know, she had all her money stolen. Someone kind of fleeced her account.
Wow.
So there were all these sort of digressions that were all juicy. And in the end, what made it very hard was sort of whittling out what couldn't be included or shouldn't be included or didn't need to be included, you know, and that was what proved really tough. And I think possibly if I'd written this in collaboration with someone, perhaps I'd have answered those questions sooner, because I think when you co-write, you don't necessarily arrive at the final draft quicker, but you at least cut out all the dead ends quicker. You just kind of discuss it and you go, well, let's forget that, or we don't need that. And it's easier to sort of hammer out what you don't want to include. And I think I struggled a lot. You know, I just kept putting too much in. I mean, I'm sure there was like 200-page drafts of this. And so that was what made it arduous, was sort of kind of cutting out stuff and deciding what needed to be in there. And it just ended up proving it was also just a very hard film to make. You know, the budget was relatively small. We were shooting on two coasts, you know, in the US and in the UK. We had very little time to shoot the wrestling sequences, and so just the whole thing was just very, very, very difficult to get made and to finish. And so it is pleasing that it's making feel good movie lists. But it's interesting. There were two things that I always was worried about that I never overcame, and I think they probably are still problems that for a certain audience will always mean that they're resistant to the film. And they were the two things I felt when I first watched the documentary. One was I didn't want to watch a documentary about wrestling because I had no interest in wrestling. And if Dwayne hadn't sent me the documentary, I probably never would have. And I think there is a portion of the audience that will never watch a movie about wrestling for that reason. And however much I explain that you don't need to like wrestling to enjoy this film, I just don't think some people will never be convinced. And secondly, I always wanted to change the title Fighting With My Family. I just never liked it as a title.
Oh, really?
It sounded like a good movie title. It sounded like a documentary. It sounded like, you know, the 400-pound man. It felt like it kind of had a bit of that sensationalism. And I kept on trying to come up with an alternative, and so did the producer. And we could just never come up with something better. And I remember at one point, one of the studios involved said, we've got it. We've come up with it. We know the title. Forget Fighting With My Family. It's called Unmatched. And I'm like, what the hell does unmatched mean? And they're like, unmatched, you know, she's unbeatable. And I said, unmatched sounds like a sort of rom-com about dating apps. And so eventually I managed to persuade them that in the absence of anything better, let's stick with Fighting With My Family. But I think probably there is a resistance to that title, maybe in the same way that I was resistant to it initially. And it's funny because when you write, you become so used to the title that in the end you think, oh, this is fine, this is perfect. No one will have a problem with it. But I think for some people, maybe they think it sounds negative, or they don't know what it means, or they don't want to watch the thing about families fighting, or they don't, because they're not expecting the irony of what the title means. And so those were two things I always meant, you know, I was always worried about and I never could conquer. And I think probably, you know, if it wasn't about wrestling and it didn't have that title, maybe it would have been an even bigger success. So, you know, but those are the breaks.
Are there lessons that you learned writing this that you've carried forward into writing since?
Well, one of the things which I've always had a problem with, and I still struggle with, is I think I have a tendency to over-explain. I'm very anxious about the audience understanding and keeping, because I'm worried that if I lose you, if you don't understand why someone's doing something, or if I hadn't bedded in why something's important, I'm worried that I'll have the movie won't work or the project won't work, you know. And so I tend to say 3 times what I could have said once.
Yeah. And
then in the editing room, once I've filmed the film, then I can go back and cut them out. And so, for instance, in this film, I've told you about all those kind of levels of exposition, but I was, like I say, I was obsessed with, would you think Paige wanted to be the heavyweight champion of the world? Or did you think she was only doing it for her family? And I was obsessed with this. And so I had footage of her as a young girl holding up this fake cardboard bell and talking about how much she wanted to be the champion. And I had scenes which I shot of her watching those old home movies of her with the bell and constantly trying to reiterate, trust me, she wants this. So when she wins at the end, it means something to her. Please, trying to shake the audience by the lapels, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, again, once you're in the test screenings or with showing it to friends and family, you realize you don't need that.
Yeah.
People understood. They got it. They didn't need to be at this point to be labored. But I think what's hard in the writing process is sort of trusting yourself that you've made your point, you know? And I don't know why that is. I think it's just because you're writing for the page. And so I think because you're writing for a reader, once it's brought to life by actors, the actor's face will tell you so much. And you see Jack Loudon looking upset. You believe he's upset. You don't need him to say, I'm upset.
Yeah.
And you don't need Florence Pugh to say, I want this dream. She will do that for you. But I think on the written page, somehow you feel the need to explain that more. And often that's in dialogue. And that dialogue is the first thing that gets cut out in the editing room. And so I don't think I've quite reconciled that. But I think now I write one script, if you like, for the reader, knowing that what we'll put on the screen will be different.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Did you also learn, or did it underline to you the value of looking for stories in unexpected places? Because you mentioned that you would have never watched this documentary or come across this story if it hadn't been sent to you by The Rock. And in a way, it's interesting because you started your career, you and Ricky Gervais, writing about what you know and writing about, and this is like the complete other end of the spectrum. It's writing about something you have no idea about at the beginning of the process. So is that something, did you kind of like come to any conclusions about looking for stories in unexpected places? Well,
one of the things I delight in is the fact that people in writing about the film say it's an unlikely mix of things. Me, The Rock, WWE, it is an unlikely mix of things. But like you say, that's exactly the reason to do it.
Yeah.
Was it did feel, it's very hard to find something that feels cinematic, by which I mean a small story that feels cinematic, that isn't about superheroes or dinosaurs. Because I think we're in an age now in which, there's so much great movie content on TV made for Netflix or Amazon and so on, that to sort of have something that's in the theaters, as they say in America, in the cinema itself is quite hard to find something that has a bit of scale to the story. And I think sports movies are one of the few things that do, in a way, have that, because they have stadiums and they have sort of physical contact. And so you don't have to have guns and explosions, but you still have a physicality. There's something cinematic about the clashing of bodies, in a ring. And I think, so that was something that I felt this had, was it sort of felt, it was a small movie and it was a British movie, but it had something cinematic in it and it had some scale. So you're right in that sense. It definitely, I want to look for sort of things that feel unique in that way and a bit different. But I think, despite that on the surface it feels not the obvious fit for me, what it has is like you say, so many of the things which I've explored in the past and which I'm interested in. Lives of quiet desperation, lives that perhaps could have played out in a different way. It's about kind of working class people who have a dream and go to America and sort of make that dream come true, which is something I feel to some degree I've done.
Yeah.
And so I felt a great affinity with Paige and the brother in that regard. And I felt a kinship with the family in a way. I mean, yes, my family aren't quite as sort of fruity and earthy as that. And they haven't been in jail and stuff, but we do trade in humor and we give each other shit, and we are sort of soft mocking in some way. And so there was a lot of elements in this story that I connected with. And I don't know, that was what I sort of wanted to try and convey to the audience, was sort of my sort of appreciation of this woman's journey. And also I don't think I even realized it straight away, but you realize as well that there's not a lot of stories about working class women from the UK who have sort of global success. You see quite a lot of stories about sort of privileged English women, whether it's, I don't know, Virginia Woolf or someone. But the idea of like a kind of gritty working class woman who, and again, yes, we tell those stories, but they tend to be about, quite depressing, gritty, realistic stories about how hard it is to live in a council house. But the sort of idea of that, of a little bit of Mike Leigh, but with a little bit of Rocky thrown in, seemed quite an unlikely, an unfamiliar combination.
Yeah, especially if she doesn't tone down any of those kind of like working class British. Yeah,
that's right. In fact, if anything, the makeover is the one thing she shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
Whereas normally, the idea is, you have to sort of refine yourself in order to get acceptance.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, before we go, can I just ask, like, this film was a huge success, and as we talked about at the beginning, people are still finding this film and enjoying this film. With Fighting With My Family behind you, kind of, what's next for you? What have you been working on, and where will we see your writing talents next?
Well, I've been working on a TV project which I've been gestating for a long time, which is something I actually started filming, and then 2 weeks into filming we had to shut down, obviously, because of the lockdown, like everybody else. So this was a project that I originated with again, you're mentioning about kind of finding unlikely stories, or in this case, unlikely collaborators. And if me and The Rock is not the obvious partnership, then me and this guy Elgin James aren't, because Elgin was a reformed Boston punk gang member who used to extort money from neo-Nazis and give it to Jewish organizations, and went to jail for a year. And now he's a TV writer, a screenwriter in the States. And I had asked to be paired up with someone who just couldn't be further from me, because I had this sort of vague idea about people doing community service. My parents had, in Bristol when I was growing up, they used to supervise people doing community service. When you get like a drink driving charge or some minor petty theft, and instead of sending you to prison, they make you paint a fence in a park or pick up rubbish at the side of the street. Yeah. My parents used to be involved with that. And I always thought that was an interesting way of bringing unlikely groups of people together, because, you could have a school teacher doing it, and you could have a 16-year-old, drug dealer. And I always thought that was an interesting combination of people. And so Elgin and I collaborated on this, and we kind of turned it into a TV show. And so that's what I have been making. But unfortunately, like I say, it got shut down. So we're now just sort of in limbo, trying to figure out when we can resume.
Yeah. And has that got a name, and where can we see it?
Well, it was called, or is called, The Offenders, but again, I suspect that title will change to Unmatched. Unmatched is almost a title you could apply to almost any film, I've realized. Yes, no, it's called The Offenders, but I think there is a TV show called The Young Offenders, so we may have to change it. But it's with BBC and with Amazon at the moment, and it's a sort of co-pro with them. So we've been working on that, and I'm taking lockdown as an opportunity to kind of refine the script and things. But so that's what I've been working on. And then I'm looking for another film project. But as I said, it's very hard to find something that feels both cinematic and also that you want to sort of spend 2 or 3 of your years of your life on, because that's inevitably how long films take. And so, just trying to find the right idea or come up with the right idea. Yeah.
Well, Stephen, this has been fascinating. I can't wait for The Offenders, or Unmatched, as it might be called. Thanks so much for joining us. Fighting With My Family is on Netflix in the UK. And where can people find it in the US, Stephen?
I think it's on Hulu, maybe. And obviously, you can VOD it, various outlets. And probably even buy it on old school DVD if you want.
Yeah. Although I was just realizing I'm recommending this film as if we haven't just spent an hour spoiling every single element of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you might want to put that up front. Spoilers on the way.
There we go. All right. Well, thanks so much, Stephen. This has been Script Apart. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
You've been listening to Script Apart with me, Al Horner, produced by Kamil Demek, with music by Stefan Bindley Taylor. Get in touch by emailing us at thescriptapartpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.